No one in that restaurant had ever spoken to her mother like a human being before, Daniel Whitmore would later say, until the quiet waitress raised her hands. On a cold Friday evening in Manhattan, the kind where the wind slid between glass skyscrapers and rattled the doors of expensive restaurants, Whitmore's steakhouse glowed like a jewel on Madison Avenue. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above white tablecloths, and the low hum of wealthy conversations floated through the air like soft music. Executives discussed deals worth millions. A couple celebrated an anniversary with a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. And near the center of the room sat Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire CEO known across Wall Street for building one of the largest private investment firms in the country before he turned 40. Daniel Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who waited for anything. His time was scheduled in 15-minute blocks, his decisions moved markets, and his name alone could open doors that stayed closed to everyone else. But tonight he wasn't thinking about business. Across from him sat his mother, Margaret Whitmore, a graceful woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled neatly behind her ears and gentle eyes that had seen more life than most people in that room combined. Margaret had been deaf since childhood. Daniel had grown up speaking with his hands before he learned how to negotiate contracts. Yet over the years, he had watched something slowly disappear from her life. Conversation. Most restaurants didn't know how to speak to her. Servers smiled politely, nodded awkwardly, or turned their questions to Daniel instead. Margaret would simply smile back, patient and kind, pretending she didn't notice. Tonight seemed no different. A young server approached the table, spoke quickly, and when Margaret responded with a small gesture of her hands, confusion flickered across the server's face. "It's okay," Daniel said quietly, translating the order himself. The server nodded and hurried away, relieved. Daniel exhaled slowly. This happened everywhere. The wealthiest restaurant in Manhattan, a dining room full of Ivy League graduates and global investors, yet not a single person knew how to greet his mother. Margaret noticed the tension in his shoulders and gave him a reassuring smile, the kind only mothers could give, as if to say everything was fine. Then, a few minutes later, someone else approached the table. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, carrying a water pitcher and a small notepad. Most diners wouldn't have noticed her at all. Her name was Emily Carter, 26 years old. Honey brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail. A standard black server's uniform that looked exactly like every other employee in the room. She was the kind of waitress busy executives barely glanced at when she refilled their glasses. But as Emily reached the Whitmore table, something unexpected happened. Instead of speaking, she gently set down the water pitcher. Then she looked directly at Margaret Whitmore and raised her hands. Her fingers moved gracefully through the air. Clear, confident, precise. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore," she signed with a warm smile. "Would you like tea tonight, or perhaps your usual chamomile?" Margaret Whitmore's eyes widened. For a moment she simply stared, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had seen. Then her face lit up in a way Daniel hadn't witnessed in months. Her hands lifted immediately, answering in fluent sign language. "Yes, chamomile would be lovely, thank you." Around them, the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued, glasses clinking, forks touching porcelain. But at table 12 something had completely changed. Daniel Whitmore slowly leaned forward in his chair, watching the shy waitress speak with his mother in perfect sign language. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire CEO was the one who didn't understand a word. Daniel Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, but now he simply sat there, watching the quiet waitress converse with his mother as if they had known each other for years. Margaret Whitmore's hands moved with growing excitement, her elegant fingers forming questions and small jokes that Daniel had not seen her share with a stranger in a very long time. Emily Carter responded with calm precision, her gestures smooth and confident, her expression warm but modest, as if what she was doing was the most ordinary thing in the world. Daniel leaned slightly forward, studying every movement. Sign language had always fascinated him. It was a language of motion and attention, a language that required people to truly look at one another. Most people never learned it because it demanded patience. Emily did not look impatient at all. She looked comfortable. Margaret signed something that made her laugh softly, covering her mouth with her hand the way she always did when she was amused. Emily nodded and signed back carefully. I will bring the chamomile tea right away. Daniel watched the exchange closely, and something unusual settled over the table. For once, the conversation was not moving through him. Normally, he acted as the bridge between his mother and the world around her. Tonight, that role belonged to someone else. Emily returned a moment later with a porcelain teapot, placing it gently in front of Margaret. She poured the tea slowly, so the steam rose in thin silver curls under the chandelier light. Then she signed again, asking whether Margaret preferred lemon or honey. Margaret answered immediately. Honey, please. Emily placed a small glass jar beside the cup and gave a respectful nod before stepping back. Daniel finally spoke. Where did you learn sign language? His voice was calm, but curiosity sharpened every word. Emily paused for a moment as if she had expected the question eventually. Her eyes lifted to meet his, steady but unpretentious. I learned it a long time ago, she said softly. Then she added with a polite smile. Would your mother like anything else this evening? Margaret gently touched Daniel's sleeve and signed something quickly. Daniel washed her hands and translated automatically. She says your signing is beautiful. Emily's expression softened with genuine appreciation. She turned back to Margaret and signed thank you. The older woman's smile widened. Around them the restaurant continued its polished routine. A sommelier presented a bottle of wine to another table. A group of investors discussed quarterly profits in low voices. None of them realized that something quietly extraordinary was happening at table 12. Daniel studied the young waitress more carefully now. Her posture was confident but humble. Her movements were efficient without being rushed. She carried herself differently from many servers he had met in luxury restaurants. There was an alertness in her eyes that suggested she was paying attention to far more than orders and table numbers. Emily, Daniel said after glancing briefly at the name stitched on her uniform. Yes, sir, she replied politely. Sign language is not exactly common training for restaurant staff. Emily gave a small, thoughtful pause before answering. Sometimes people learn things for reasons that have nothing to do with their job. The response was simple, but Daniel noticed something in the way she said it. It sounded less like an explanation and more like a quiet truth. Margaret watched the two of them with interest, her eyes moving from Daniel to Emily and back again. Then she signed another quick sentence with a playful smile. Daniel read her hands and raised one eyebrow slightly. My mother says you speak with your hands better than most people speak with their voices. Emily laughed quietly at that, the sound gentle and sincere. Your mother is very kind, she signed back to Margaret. Daniel sat back in his chair, observing the moment with growing curiosity. In the middle of Manhattan's most expensive dining room, surrounded by power and money and reputation, the person who had created the most meaningful conversation of the evening was a shy waitress who almost nobody had noticed when she walked into the room. Daniel Whitmore had built his entire career on noticing details that others ignored, and now his attention remained fixed on Emily Carter long after she had stepped away from their table. Margaret Whitmore sipped her chamomile tea slowly, her expression calm but thoughtful, as if she were still replaying the brief conversation in her mind. She signed something gently toward her son. Daniel washed her hands automatically. She is kind, Margaret signed. Not polite. Kind. There is a difference. Daniel nodded slowly because he understood exactly what she meant. Politeness could be taught in employee training manuals. Kindness could not. Across the dining room, Emily moved quietly between tables, carrying plates with steady hands and speaking softly with guests who barely looked up from their conversations. If someone had asked Daniel 10 minutes earlier to identify the most interesting person in the restaurant, he would have pointed toward the investors discussing acquisitions near the window, or perhaps the technology executive hosting a private dinner near the bar. Now his attention kept returning to a waitress in a simple uniform who moved through the room almost unnoticed. Margaret signed another question, curiosity sparkling in her eyes. Does she work here every night? Daniel looked around until he noticed a tall man in a black suit speaking with the host's stand near the entrance. The restaurant manager. Daniel stood and walked across the room with the quiet confidence of a man used to being recognized. The manager noticed him immediately and straightened his posture. Mr. Whitmore, is everything satisfactory this evening? Daniel nodded politely. Everything is excellent. I just had a quick question about one of your staff members. The manager followed Daniel's gaze toward Emily, who was placing a tray of glasses on a service counter. Emily Carter, the manager said. One of our most reliable servers. She has been here about 8 months. Daniel folded his arms lightly. She speaks sign language. The manager gave a small surprised smile. Yes, she does. Actually, she speaks several languages, from what I understand. Daniel raised one eyebrow slightly. Several. I have heard her speaking French with guests before. And once she helped a tourist couple who only spoke Italian. I am not sure how many languages she actually knows, but she seems to manage quite well. Daniel glanced again toward Emily as she walked back toward the dining area. Interesting, he said quietly. The manager shrugged gently. Emily does not talk much about herself. She shows up on time, works hard, and treats guests well. That is usually all I need to know. Daniel thanked him and returned to the table where Margaret waited patiently. She studied his face immediately, reading the subtle shift in his expression the way only mothers could. What did you learn? She signed with curiosity. Daniel sat down slowly. Her name is Emily Carter. He translated aloud as he signed back to her. She has worked here less than a year, and apparently she speaks several languages. Margaret's eyes brightened with interest. She signed another thought carefully. People who understand many languages usually listen carefully to the world. Daniel considered that for a moment. Across the restaurant, Emily approached another table where a family was celebrating a birthday. She laughed softly at something the child said and adjusted a candle on the dessert plate before stepping back. Daniel noticed the way she gave the attention fully to whoever she was serving in that moment. Focused. Present. The same kind of attention that successful negotiators practice during critical meetings. Margaret gently touched Daniel's hand and signed again with a knowing smile. You should ask her story. Daniel watched Emily for another quiet moment. In a city filled with powerful people and loud ambition, the most intriguing mystery in the room was a waitress who moved through the crowd with quiet intelligence and spoke a language most of the world never bothered to learn. Daniel Whitmore had always believed that the most valuable information appeared in quiet moments, not in loud boardrooms. So instead of returning immediately to his conversation with his mother, he continued watching Emily Carter move through the restaurant with careful attention. Margaret Whitmore followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. You are studying her like a business problem, she signed gently. Daniel gave a small amused smile and answered with his hands as well. I am curious. That is all. Margaret raised one eyebrow with playful skepticism, but said nothing more. Across the dining room, a couple near the window was speaking softly in French, their accents unmistakably Parisian. Daniel noticed Emily approaching their table with a water pitcher. The man spoke quickly to his companion, gesturing toward the menu with a slight frown. Emily paused beside the table and listened for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she responded in fluent French. The couple immediately looked up with visible relief. Their expressions shifted from confusion to gratitude as Emily calmly explained one of the dishes and suggested an alternative that suited their preference. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet the transformation at the table was unmistakable. The guests were smiling now, completely at ease. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing what he had just seen. He had negotiated international partnerships in Paris and Geneva. He knew exactly how difficult it was to speak a language naturally rather than simply memorizing phrases. Emily had not hesitated even for a second. Margaret touched his arm and signed again with quiet delight. You see. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, I see. Emily returned to the service station and wrote something on a small notepad before delivering another order to a nearby table. Her movements were calm, precise, efficient. Nothing about her behavior suggested that she considered what she had done to be unusual. For her, switching languages appeared to be as ordinary as pouring water into a glass. Daniel found himself increasingly intrigued. Most people he met were eager to display their talents, especially in places where wealthy guests might notice them. Emily seemed to do the opposite. She worked quietly, almost invisibly, never drawing attention to herself unless someone needed help. Margaret studied her son's expression carefully before signing another thought. Some people carry entire worlds inside them and never speak about it. Daniel looked down at the tablecloth thoughtfully. That sentence lingered in his mind. Entire worlds inside them. Across the room, Emily approached their table once more, this time carrying a plate with a slice of warm apple tart. She set it down gently in front of Margaret and signed with a soft smile. The chef sent this for you. He heard it was your favorite. Margaret's face brightened immediately, and she signed her thanks warmly. Daniel watched the interaction again, fascinated by the effortless rhythm between them. Finally he spoke. Emily, he said. She looked toward him politely. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. Daniel gestured lightly toward the dining room, where the French couple was now happily sharing their meal. You speak French quite well. Emily gave a small nod as if the compliment surprised her slightly. I practiced for a few years. Daniel tilted his head with interest. And Italian too, according to the manager. Emily hesitated just long enough for Daniel to notice. Then she answered calmly. A little. Margaret observed the exchange closely, sensing the quiet tension building in the conversation. Daniel rested his hands on the table and looked directly at the young waitress who had somehow become the most interesting person in the room. Emily, he said thoughtfully, most people spend years learning one language. You seem to understand several. That usually means there is a story behind it. Emily met his gaze for a moment. Then she gave a small, mysterious smile. Sometimes, she said gently, people learn languages because someone important in their life needs them to. Emily Carter's answer lingered in the air even after she had stepped back from the table. Sometimes people learn languages because someone important in their life needs them to. Daniel Whitmore watched her carefully as she turned and walked toward another group of diners waiting near the center of the room. The sentence sounded simple, yet something in her voice suggested that it carried more meaning than she had chosen to explain. Margaret Whitmore slowly stirred honey into her tea, the spoon making a soft circle against the porcelain cup. She looked at her son and signed thoughtfully. That was not a casual answer. Daniel nodded quietly because he understood the same thing. People who carried complicated histories often spoke that way, revealing just enough truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting the rest. Across the restaurant, Emily knelt beside a table where a young boy was examining the dessert menu with serious concentration. She pointed to a picture of a chocolate cake and said something that made the child grin with excitement. Then she stood again and wrote the order down before disappearing briefly into the kitchen. Daniel leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. She is unusual, he said aloud, even though his mother could already read the thought in his expression. Margaret signed with gentle amusement. You are intrigued. Daniel gave a small shrug. Would you not be curious if you discovered a financial analyst working as a waiter? Margaret smiled at the comparison but then signed another sentence carefully. Intelligence does not always choose the life people expect. Daniel looked across the room again as Emily returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of desserts. She balanced the plates with effortless precision, weaving between tables without disturbing a single guest. The quiet confidence in her movements reminded Daniel of experienced surgeons he had once observed at a medical charity event. People who performed complex work often developed that same calm focus. Emily delivered the desserts to the birthday table and lit a small candle before stepping back so the family could sing. For a moment, the entire table laughed together while the child made a wish. Emily waited patiently until the celebration ended, then cleared a few plates and returned to the service counter. Daniel noticed that she never rushed anyone. Even in a busy restaurant, she seemed to understand exactly when to step forward and when to disappear. Margaret followed his gaze again and then signed something unexpected. You should thank her. Daniel looked back at his mother with mild surprise. Thank her. For the conversation. For seeing me. Daniel paused because he realized she was right. For many years Margaret Whitmore had quietly accepted a world that rarely tried to communicate with her. Tonight a stranger had changed that without hesitation. Daniel stood from the table and walked slowly across the restaurant toward the service station where Emily was arranging silverware. She looked up when she noticed him approaching, clearly surprised that one of the most recognizable businessmen in New York was standing beside her work counter. Mr. Whitmore, she said politely. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the edge of the counter and spoke with unusual sincerity. I wanted to thank you for the way you spoke with my mother tonight. Emily blinked slightly, as if the gratitude had caught her off guard. She is a wonderful woman, Emily replied gently. She deserves to be spoken to. Daniel studied her face for a moment. That answer, once again, sounded far deeper than the words themselves. Emily, he said thoughtfully, you mentioned that someone important in your life needed those languages. Emily's eyes softened, and for a brief moment the confident waitress seemed to reveal a quieter, more personal side of herself. Yes, she said softly. My younger brother. Daniel waited, sensing that the real story was finally beginning to surface. Emily Carter's voice softened when she spoke those two words, my younger brother, and for a brief moment the busy sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade behind the quiet weight of that explanation. Daniel Whitmore did not interrupt. Years of leading negotiations had taught him that when someone finally began to share something personal, the most important thing was patience. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining room to make sure none of her tables needed attention. Then she rested her hands lightly on the service counter. My brother's name is Lucas, she said gently. He was born deaf. Daniel listened closely while she continued. When we were children, my parents worked long hours. My mother tried to learn sign language from library books, but most of the time it was just the two of us after school. Lucas and I spent hours practicing together. At first we only knew simple words. Food, home, school. But every week we learned more. Emily gave a small nostalgic smile, as if the memory was both warm and distant. For him, sign language was the only way to communicate with the world. So I decided the world should not feel small to him. Daniel noticed the quiet determination behind her words. It was not pride. It was simply a statement of fact. Emily continued. When Lucas was 10 years old, he became fascinated with travel documentaries. He would watch videos about cities in Europe and ask questions about the people there. I realized something then. If he ever wanted to travel or study abroad someday, he would need someone who could help him communicate. Daniel nodded slowly, beginning to understand the story that had shaped her life. So you learned other languages too? Emily gave a small shrug. At first it was just curiosity. I borrowed language textbooks from the public library. French, Italian, Spanish. Later, when I started college, I studied linguistics more seriously. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. College. Emily nodded. Columbia University. I was studying international communication. Daniel recognized the name immediately. One of the most prestigious universities in the country. He studied her expression carefully. But you are working here instead. Emily did not seem embarrassed by the question. She simply answered with the same calm honesty she had shown all evening. Lucas received an opportunity to attend a specialized school for deaf students in Boston. It was an incredible program, but the tuition was expensive. My parents had already sacrificed a lot. I decided to pause my studies for a while so I could help. Daniel remained silent for a moment, absorbing what she had said. Across the dining room, the soft glow of candlelight reflected off polished glasses, while conversations about business deals and vacation homes continued as usual. Yet standing here beside the service counter, Daniel realized he was hearing a story far more meaningful than any conversation happening at the surrounding tables. Emily straightened a stack of napkins and glanced briefly toward table 12, where Margaret Whitmore was watching the exchange with quiet interest. Lucas is doing very well now, Emily added with quiet pride. He is studying computer design. He wants to create software that helps people communicate more easily. Daniel felt a slow smile appear. That sounds like an ambitious goal. Emily nodded. He has always been ambitious. Daniel looked back toward his mother, who was still observing them from across the room. For the first time that evening he began to understand something important. The languages Emily spoke were not academic achievements. They were bridges she had built for someone she loved. And suddenly the shy waitress standing beside the service counter seemed far more remarkable than anyone else in the restaurant. Daniel Whitmore stood quietly beside the service counter for a few seconds after Emily finished speaking, letting her story settle in his mind. The restaurant around them continued its elegant rhythm. Waiters moved between tables carrying polished trays. Glasses clinked softly beneath the chandeliers, and the low murmur of wealthy conversations filled the air. Yet Daniel barely noticed any of it. He was thinking about a young woman who had quietly rearranged her entire life so her brother could have a bigger future. That is a remarkable sacrifice, Daniel said finally. Emily shook her head gently. It never felt like a sacrifice. She folded a clean napkin and placed it neatly beside the silverware stack. Lucas always believed the world was bigger than the limits people placed on him. I just wanted to make sure he had someone standing beside him when he went out to explore it. Daniel studied her expression carefully. There was no trace of self-pity in her voice. Only quiet pride. That detail impressed him more than anything she had said earlier. Many people he met spent their lives talking about what they deserved. Emily Carter seemed far more interested in what someone else needed. Across the dining room, Margaret Whitmore watched the conversation continue with attentive eyes. She lifted one hand and gave Daniel a small wave, signaling him to come back to the table. Daniel glanced toward Emily. "My mother would like to speak with you again before we leave." Emily nodded politely. "Of course." They walked together toward table 12 where Margaret was waiting patiently with her teacup resting in both hands. As Emily approached, Margaret's face brightened again, and she immediately began signing with warm enthusiasm. "I enjoyed our conversation very much," Margaret said through her hands. Emily answered with equal warmth. "I did too." Daniel sat down again, while the two women continued their silent conversation. Watching them felt strangely peaceful. His mother's hands moved more animatedly than they had in months, and Emily followed every gesture with focused attention. After a moment, Margaret turned to Daniel and signed something slowly so he could translate aloud. "She says she hopes your brother continues his studies," Daniel explained. Emily smiled softly. "He will. He has never been the kind of person who stops chasing an idea once it appears in his mind." Margaret nodded approvingly. Then she signed another question that made Emily pause thoughtfully before answering. "What do you want for your own future?" Emily considered the question carefully. The restaurant lights reflected gently in her eyes while she searched for the right words. "I would like to return to school someday," she admitted. "Languages connect people who would otherwise never understand each other. I think the world could use more translators." Daniel felt a subtle shift in the conversation. The answer was modest, but the ambition behind it was unmistakable. Margaret smiled warmly and signed one more sentence. "The world also needs people who listen before they speak." Emily lowered her gaze slightly, humbled by the compliment. Daniel leaned back in his chair and observed the moment quietly. In a single evening, he had watched his mother laugh, converse, and share stories with someone who had entered the room as an invisible server. The realization struck him with surprising clarity. Some people walked through life chasing power and recognition. Others quietly built bridges that allowed strangers to understand one another. And standing beside his table was someone who had been building those bridges her entire life without ever asking the world to notice. The evening at Whitmore's Steakhouse slowly moved toward its quiet final hour, when the busiest conversations faded and the soft glow of the chandeliers felt warmer than before. Daniel Whitmore noticed that his mother seemed unusually relaxed, her posture lighter than when they had arrived earlier that night. Margaret Whitmore rested her hands around her teacup and looked at Emily Carter with the calm appreciation of someone who had just experienced something rare. She signed a short sentence with deliberate clarity. "Thank you for speaking with me like an old friend." Emily washed her hands carefully and answered with the same gentle respect she had shown all evening. "It was my pleasure." Margaret smiled again and then glanced at Daniel, signaling that she had said what she wished to say. Emily began to step back toward the service area, assuming their conversation had ended, but Daniel spoke before she could leave. "Emily," he said thoughtfully. She paused and turned back toward him. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together on the table. His voice was calm, but there was a seriousness behind the question. "You mentioned earlier that you hope to return to school someday." Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, and that you want to become a translator." "That is the goal." Daniel looked around the dining room for a moment. The same restaurant that had once seemed like the center of the evening now felt like a quiet background scene. His attention returned to Emily. "People who build companies like mine spend a great deal of time traveling. Meetings in Europe, conferences in Asia, negotiations in places where language barriers slow everything down. Professional translators are often the most valuable people in the room." Emily listened politely, unsure where the conversation was leading. Daniel continued, "But the rarest translators are the ones who understand not just the words, but the people speaking them." Emily tilted her head slightly, considering his meaning. Margaret watched the exchange with growing curiosity, her eyes moving between them. Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small business card. The white card carried the understated logo of Whitmore Holdings, a company known across the financial world. He placed it on the table between them. "If you decide to return to your studies," Daniel said carefully, "I would be interested in helping you make that possible." Emily looked at the card but did not pick it up immediately. "Helping how?" she asked quietly. Daniel answered simply. "Scholarship support. Tuition assistance." Perhaps even a position with my company once you finish your degree. Emily blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct offer. Daniel raised one hand slightly before she could respond. This is not charity, he explained. This is an investment in someone who understands communication better than most executives I meet. Margaret's eyes brightened at those words, and she signed a quick sentence with a proud smile. He is finally learning to listen. Emily glanced from the card to Daniel, and then to Margaret, processing the moment slowly. Around them, the restaurant staff continued their evening routine, unaware that something quietly significant had just been placed on the table. For the first time since she began working that shift, Emily Carter seemed genuinely uncertain about what to say next. Emily Carter looked down at the business card resting quietly on the white tablecloth, as if it were something fragile rather than a simple piece of paper. The elegant black lettering of Whitmore Holdings reflected faintly in the candlelight. For a long moment, she did not reach for it. The restaurant around them continued its slow rhythm toward closing time. Chairs shifted softly across polished floors. A waiter carried the final bottle of wine to a table near the window. Somewhere near the kitchen, a faint laugh echoed from the staff preparing for the end of the evening. Yet at table 12 everything felt still. Daniel Whitmore watched Emily carefully, not with the impatience of a businessman expecting an answer, but with quiet curiosity. He had spent most of his life surrounded by people who accepted opportunities immediately, sometimes before he had even finished explaining them. Emily Carter did something different. She thought. Finally she looked up. That is very generous, she said softly. Daniel shook his head slightly. It is practical, he replied. People who understand communication are rare. People who care about it are even rarer. Emily glanced briefly toward Margaret Whitmore, who was watching the moment with warm interest. Margaret lifted her hands and signed a gentle sentence. Opportunity sometimes arrives disguised as kindness. Emily read the movement of Margaret's hands and smiled faintly. Then she carefully picked up the business card. Not with excitement, not with hesitation, simply with thoughtful respect. If I return to school, Emily said slowly, it will be because I want to become better at connecting people, not because of money or position. Daniel nodded once. That is exactly why I offered. Emily studied the card again before slipping it into the small pocket of her apron. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the quiet weight of possibility. Margaret Whitmore then reached forward and lightly touched Emily's hand to get her attention. When Emily looked down, Margaret signed another message, her movements slower and more deliberate this time. Tonight you reminded me of something important. Emily watched closely and responded through sign language as well. What is that? Margaret's hands moved again. The world often speaks too loudly, but the most meaningful conversations happen when someone chooses to truly listen. Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, clearly moved by the words. Thank you, she signed back. Daniel stood and gently helped his mother rise from the table. Their evening was coming to an end, but the quiet impact of it lingered in the air. As they prepared to leave, Daniel turned once more toward Emily. If you ever decide to continue your studies, he said calmly, call the number on that card. Emily nodded. I will remember. Daniel offered a respectful smile before guiding his mother toward the exit. As the doors of the restaurant closed behind them and the cool Manhattan night air greeted the street outside, Margaret Whitmore looked at her son and signed one final thought with a knowing smile. The quiet ones are never ordinary. Inside the restaurant, Emily Carter returned to clearing the last table of the evening, the business card resting quietly in her apron pocket like a small promise for the future.